Westward Expansion, Section 2 with Ms. Lashy. The Bessemer Process. The Bessemer process made it possible to build more railroads and skyscrapers. Railroads began to stretch from one end of the country to the other. So the Bessemer process, essentially, it's where you would take air and pump it into smelted or melted iron before it hardens, and for some reason, I'm not exactly sure, but for some reason it solidifies that and makes it stronger and more durable. And it also made it possible to produce the steel more efficiently and quicker. And because of that, it became more affordable. So it was more affordable and stronger, and they used it to build railroads, and it made skyscrapers possible. With wood structures, you can only build up so many stories. But if you have a steel structure to frame the building, you could build, as we know today, 60, 80 floors up. Of course, in this time, they're not building 60 or 80 floors up, but it does make it possible to build above 6 stories, and so you're starting to see 10, 12-story buildings in the major urban centers. The Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad connected the east to west coast of the United States. It was completed in 1869. Chinese workers helped to build it from the west, and Irish workers helped to build it from the east. So the Transcontinental Railroad is an extremely important part of westward expansion. We're connecting the east to the west coast of the United States, New York City to Los Angeles. So you can move not only goods, but you can move people back and forth, and of course mail as well. And this helped to open up the frontier because now people didn't have to travel through Indian Territory on wagons. They could go through Indian Territory on trains, and it'd be a little bit safer for them. Although Native Americans did try to interfere with the railroads by pulling up ties and etc., but it was still a safer route. And so it helped to settle the West at a more rapid and quicker pace. And of course, we talked about the Chinese workers migrating from Asia to the west coast of the United States, and they start to build the railroad from California, and they moved eastward. The Irish started to build the Continental Railroad from the east coast, and they started moving westward, and they would end up meeting in the middle. The Transcontinental Railroad continued. The railroad was built from both directions, and they met at Promontory Point, Utah. Settlers were now able to travel to the west by train. This made it safer and faster to move out west. If you look at this map here to the right, the green railroad that we see on the map, that is the section of the Transcontinental Railroad that was built by the Irish. And then the reddish orange that comes from San Francisco and meets at Promontory Point, that was built by the Chinese predominantly. Of course, it was a mixture of people, but predominantly Chinese for the reddish orange one and predominantly Irish for the green section of the Transcontinental Railroad. A lot of people ask, well, why did the Chinese build such a shorter route? Well, you have to understand that they're going through a very dense mountain range. Of course, the eastern side, the Irish side, did have to go through a mountain range, but that was pretty much already established before they started building. You could say that they really started building the eastern part of the Transcontinental Railroad from Chicago and then onward to Promontory Point if you're looking at this map. So they didn't have to move through mountains. The Chinese, who were building the reddish-orange section from San Francisco to Promontory Point, they had to move through mountains. They had to dynamite out tunnels and holes through mountains. So it was a very difficult task for them to do, but they were successful in building that section. Railroads increased business. Farmers were now able to ship their crops to the East Coast. Ranchers could also ship cattle. Railroads made it possible for farming, mining, and ranching industries to grow. So one of the things you have to consider is we have all these farms on the Great Plains, and they're growing things like corn and wheat and other crops. And they could only sell locally until the Transcontinental Railroad starts to come through, and then you have more railroads on top of that. And that makes it possible to where you could put your crops on the railroad and ship it back east and sell it to where there might not be as much food available for people to consume. So you're increasing your market by having these railroads. And there was also an increase in the cattle industry, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, but I'll give you a quick synopsis. There's a lot of wild cattle in Texas, and because of that, they are able to ship them into railroads and out to the east to turn a profit, and it's good for Texas. The steel plow. The invention of the steel plow made it possible to plant seeds faster with less work. As a result, farming became more efficient and profitable. So if you look at this picture to the right, this is a diagram of a steel plow. The top parts you would hold on with your hands, and you can also attach it to a horse on the front end. So the back you would be guiding it with your hands on those handles, and the front end you would attach it to a horse, so it would be pulling it to help you so you didn't have to push it as hard. The bottom part was the steel plow, and that would go into the dirt, and it would go through and it would push up the dirt into rows, and the dirt would be pulled off to the side. If you've ever driven past a farm that has, or a field that has just been tilled or plowed, you see rows that are dug out, straight rows, and on the side there's these little long piles of dirt. That's what it looks like when you bring a steel plow through. The purpose of this is to dig up the dirt so you can run through, plant seeds, and then you just toss the dirt back on top by, just brushing on top with your hands on either side. And it made it extremely efficient and profitable to start farming because of the steel plow. The Battle of Little Bighorn. The Sioux Indians lived in the Black Hills of North Dakota. After gold was discovered there, the United States government told the Sioux that they had to leave. The Sioux fought the U.S. Army, who were led by General Custer. The Sioux won the battle. They were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The Massacre of Wounded Knee. The Sioux were eventually forced onto a reservation. They were traditionally hunters and gatherers, and the United States government tried to make them farmers. They became restless. The U.S. Army used a machine gun to kill 300 unarmed Sioux Indians. This tragedy is known as the Massacre of Wounded Knee. So what I want to point out is that they were successful at the Battle of Little Bighorn by defeating General Custer. They literally just slaughtered him and his regiment, the 7th Cavalry. But their victory is not long lasting. They're eventually forced onto this reservation. They're not used to staying in this one section of land without hunting the buffalo or gathering fruits that they would follow seasonally. And now they're forced to live on this reservation, this plot of land, and stay put, and they're supposed to farm, and they're not really given the proper tools to do it. They're giving some of the poorest land possible. It's just not a good situation for the Sioux. It's a complete 360 or 180, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it, in terms of their culture. They're going from nomads to being settled, from hunter-gatherers to farmers, and it's just not a good situation for them. So they become restless, and they start to demand to have some improvements or changes. And the army just responds by slaughtering 300 of them unarmed, and then they just toss them into mass graves as if nothing happened. This is one of the greatest tragedies of Native American history, and we'll talk about it again when we do the Civil Rights Movement with the American Indian Movement, because they actually occupy the monument for this massacre. The decimation of the buffalo. The United States government ordered the decimation or killing of the buffalo. They were trying to force Native Americans onto reservations by taking away their main food source. They also used the materials from the buffalo for shelter, weapons, and clothing. Millions of buffalo were killed and only their hides were taken. Native Americans lost their primary food source. So Native Americans relied on the hides from the buffalo for their shelter and for their clothing. They used the bones for weapons and jewelry. Of course, they used the meat to eat. They used every possible part of the buffalo. They didn't let anything go to waste because they believed that if the animal had sacrificed their life to help them live and survive, that they needed to make use of every part of the animal. So everything was used in one way or another. And this was their main food source. They would follow the buffalo, and, as the seasons moved, they would follow the buffalo as they looked for food. And the United States government saw that if they could kill off the buffalo, they could take away their primary food source, and that might make them more accepting or submissive to the idea of moving onto reservations. So the decimation of the buffalo, the sole purpose of it was to get Native Americans to go live on reservations to free up land for settlement for the homesteaders who were moving in. Reservations. Millions of Native Americans were forced off their traditional lands and onto reservations. They were unable to hunt and gather. They were not very successful at farming as the land was poor. So the United States government intentionally picked out some of the harshest regions to settle Native Americans on to the reservations. Oklahoma entirely almost was a system of reservations. If you look at the map to the right, the yellow or gold highlighted areas are reservations of as of 1895, and that number is going to dwindle every year. That you're going to see those yellow areas shrink and shrink and shrink. But Oklahoma, even today, still has a large Native American population.